Today is a little different from yesterday. We explored theory and concept and philosophy, didn't we? And today, many members of the audience told me over tea and lunch, we want to see a bit of the operational side as well. And so today is designed to take you there. But we start off with a bang. Those of you who attended yesterday, I think it's all of us. Are there any new people here that needs a briefing on yesterday? Warren? Where's your rapporteur? But you will fall into the rhythm very quickly because we've discovered yesterday that we are outspoken. We do not hesitate to speak our minds. It's good. And one of those who did that yesterday is opening the conference for us this morning. Na'eem, you're sitting right here. Do you have a dreaded PowerPoint presentation?
No.
Oh, that's fantastic. So just before you come up, I just want to read his bio very briefly on page 18 of this very comprehensive publication, which is a program. Na'eem Jeenah, the Executive Director of the Johannesburg-based, is that significant? It is. Think tank, the Afro-Middle East Center. Very active. You must go to their website and you will pick up all of their stuff. It's worth reading. His research areas include the Middle East, the Muslim world, political Islam, South African politics. He's in the media from time to time. He wrote a book, Pretend Democracy, in 2012. When is your next book due? And on what is it?
About 2 months on political Islam.
Fantastic. There you have it. So I think Na'eem is well placed to take the floor. I just wanted to read the title of his presentation. Why does Islamic extremism flourish? And why is it useful? Which is a teaser of a title. And so I'm sure we're waiting now with anticipation to hear what it is he has to say. 9 to 9:45. So don't fill up all of this time with your presentation because it's the conversation afterwards that's so valuable for many of us. Let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Anthony. I dislike PowerPoint as much as you do, except when I think it's useful, which it sometimes is if you want to show people maps and pictures and things. And thank you to Garand and the rest of the team for inviting me to participate in this and to present at this conference. I this morning woke up at about 5 o'clock and decided to change my paper, so I've kind of rewritten it. So I hope I still remember what I wrote while I was half asleep. Let me start with a disclosure, which is a nice academic thing to do, although I think that I probably will go a little step over the line. I'm a Muslim. People might have discovered that yesterday. Oh, probably not. But I also have regarded myself as an Islamic radical. I might still do, except I think my two sons might take objection to that. They probably think I'm a bit too soft to be a radical. Both of them spent about 2 days in jail a couple of months ago, part of the Fees Must Fall protests. So I think their understanding of radical might be slightly more radical than mine is. I thought of myself as such from the 1980s when I was involved with a couple of the organizations that Muhammad spoke about yesterday that were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. Certainly thought of myself in that way when my brother was killed by apartheid police, found lying on the ground in the middle of Durban with an AK-47 next to his body. So I support Islamic radicalism. I believe in very radical Islamic thought. I believe in things like gender equality as being mandated by Islam. But I also believe that violence has a place in struggle. So in the 80s I supported the armed resistance in South Africa. I not only supported it, but believed that, that it was mandated by Islam and by the Quran. So as I said, a little bit of an academic thing about disclosure, but I think I did step over the line there. Nevertheless, that's my disclosure so you know where I'm coming from on this issue. My second kind of point of preface is, since about half of today is going to be dealing with this group that calls itself Islamic State, let me just say about the way I use the terminology. I think it's really silly to use the word Daesh instead of ISIS, because really they mean the same thing. Daesh, Dawlat al-Islam al-Iraq, fil Iraq wa Sham, Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, means exactly the same thing. Why does that group not like to use that name anymore? Because they no longer regard themselves as being only in Iraq and Sham, and so they call themselves Islamic State. You know, in the institute where I work, we're not sure that we yet regard them as a state. They're kind of pseudo-state. So, but we also prefer to call people by what they want to call themselves. So we refer to them as, it's a bit of a cop-out, I suppose, we refer to them as Islamic State Group, IS for short. But when I speak here, I prefer to say ISIS because it just rolls off the tongue more easily. There you go. When I refer to Islamic extremism, and coming more closer to what I want to speak about, when I refer to Islamic extremism, I refer, just as I did when I referred to radical Islam, I refer to Islamic extremism, not going to quibble about whether it should be Muslim extremism or not, both in terms of thought, ideology, as well as practice. Okay? So I do believe that extremist forms of Islamic thought exist even in places where there are no violence, and certainly it exists in South Africa. I gave the example yesterday of misogynists within the Muslim community who justify their misogyny by saying that yes, this is what Islam requires of us, and I believe that that is Islamic extremism. Or those who argue that Muslims should have nothing to do with non-Muslims, and believe it or not, there are people like that in South Africa, where Muslims make up 2% of the population. Those are also Islamic extremists. Oftentimes, these people don't have a big impact on the rest of society, except within their own little communities. And so, you know, much of the rest of the world kind of ignores them. For those of us who live in the Muslim community, it's very serious, because it is women within the Muslim community who are abused by these misogynists, who are not given their rights, etc. It is people that we deal with and are friends with, and whose houses we go to for meals and who come to our houses, who are not Muslim, who are impacted, and we are impacted by these ideas. But you know, for the rest of the world, it doesn't make that much of a difference unless a bomb goes off here or there. So the second part in which I look at this extremism, I would understand it, would be in terms of practice, and practice particularly that affects the broader society, and here the issue of violence comes in. As I noted, of course, earlier on, I'm not in principle opposed to using violence, or to the use of violence even by non-state actors, like the African National Congress, Pan-Africanist Congress, etc. in the past, or like Palestinian resistance groups, for that matter. The use of violence for just causes is, I believe, acceptable, but I do believe that there are uses of violence, like some of the kinds of things we've been speaking about yesterday, and we will speak about today, that are not legitimate, and that are part of a particular worldview which itself is extremist. So what I will refer to in this presentation as Islamic extremism, I think will cover both of these. Islamic extremist thought, or extremist Islamic thought, coupled with violent action whose targets often include civilians. I should say here that I agree with what Baran said yesterday, that we should be, well, he didn't say this exactly, but the implication, that we should be careful about how the term extremism is used. That generally, extremists are determined by states because their monopoly over violence is threatened by certain groups, and therefore these groups are then labeled extremists and not allowed to use violence, or not allowed to articulate themselves in various kinds of ways. Now, when we're looking at this manifestation of what I'm calling Islamic extremism, what we've been calling it, in yesterday and will be today, I think it's extremely important that we contextualize where this exists and the environment within which it flourishes, the environment within which it operates. And so when I made the point in the topic about how Islamic extremism flourishes, it is about these contextual conditions that allow it to happen. If we consider the past 3 or 4 decades, which is, I think, perhaps for our purposes here, really the longest span that we're looking at in terms of this phenomenon, Muslims in various parts of the world have been faced with a context which has been characterized by rulers who lack legitimacy, by socio-economic and other forms of marginalization, by foreign intervention, especially military foreign intervention, into all parts of the formerly colonized world, and especially in Muslim countries, by occupation. We consider Palestine, we consider Iraq in the past decade and a half, a crisis of democracy generally in the Muslim world, but also beyond, a crisis of identity for many in the Muslim world, and also many Muslims in the Muslim world, but also outside of the Muslim world. Globalization and its associated hardships in the so-called third world, a constant reduction in the space that is allowed religion in the lives of people, and for them, particularly in the lives of Muslims. And in the past half a decade, failure of the Middle East and North Africa uprisings, a term which I prefer to use rather than Arab Spring. I will refer to a few of these as factors which allow this kind of extremism to flourish, to grow, to get support. Many of these factors existed and came to a head in the 1980s in the Muslim world. A period when you had a general problem in post-colonial states across the so-called third world, which were faced with capitalist globalization and the subsequent socio-economic deprivation that followed. The effects of structural adjustment, we Africans know about that very well. Crisis of identities in many such post-colonial states. In many Muslim countries, most Muslim countries, in this period that we're talking about, extreme repression by the state, and states that were supported by various foreign actors. In many of these states, no democracy whatsoever, but also no movement towards democracy, as many other countries in the post-colonial world began staggering towards some sense of democracy, or some sense of allowing their citizens some say in the affairs of their societies. And then religious repression that we found, for example, in the Soviet Union, in Turkey under the Kemalists, in Tunisia under Ben Ali, and in some of the Muslim states where this kind of repression took place, the repression of religion was both a repression and a co-option. So Ben Ali in Tunisia, for example, passed a fatwa, passed a law actually, but fatwa means decree. So he passed a decree that he would be henceforth the only interpreter of the Quran, and no one else was allowed to interpret the Quran. So it was a mixture of repression of religion but co-option at the same time. And this was in much of the Muslim world. In the 1980s, there was hardly a part of the Muslim world that you could say was was close to being democratic. In general, then, we find that these kinds of groups flourish in contexts where legitimate grievances exist among people, which these groups then tack onto and then respond in the best way they know how. And often, the best way they know how is by mobilizing the tools that they have, the philosophical, ideological tools that they have available. And often that is religion, in this case Islam. In other contexts, in the Arab world, for example, those tools included socialism, those tools included Marxism, Arab nationalism at different points in time. This is how people generally respond to grievances. These groups do especially well when communities in or from which they operate recognize and have the same grievances that they do, and thus see in such groups attempts at redressing the situation. And so at the very least, they would turn a blind eye to the operation of these groups. So they don't necessarily agree with them, or don't necessarily support them, but they're one of us, and they're addressing the same thing that we want to address. An academic friend of mine recently told me a story. He was having a discussion with a scholar, an Egyptian scholar, Hassan Hanafi, who's regarded in Egypt as being, what do they call him? An Islamic Marxist or Islamic leftist or something like that. Anyway, and so this friend of mine, who's a South African academic, was chatting to Hassan Hanafi and was railing on about Al-Qaeda. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, before ISIS became a big thing. And Hassan Hanafi, who, by the way, Al-Qaeda probably would like to, kill if they could. Hassan Hanafi made an interesting comment to this friend. And he said, in the 1970s and 1980s, you being in the ANC, what did you think of the PAC? Did you agree with everything that they said, the Pan-Africanist Congress? And he said, very highly problematic, and this, that, and the other. Yes, but did you regard them as part of the liberation movement? Of course we did. We disagreed with them vehemently on all kinds of things, principles, strategies, and tactics, but they were part of the liberation movement. So, Hassan Hanafi responded, why can't you see Shabab as being part of the global anti-imperialist movement? Now, the point I'm making is that in many of these communities, there might be the same kind of disdain even for these groups that ANC activists in Soweto might have had for Pan-Africanists. But the enemy is common, and so we'll turn a blind eye to their excesses, except when it helps us to win supporters back from them. But otherwise, we turn a blind eye. And so it is this kind of environment of these legitimate grievances that then allow them to flourish and allow others to allow them to flourish. I think a good example of this really is Boko Haram in Nigeria. Boko Haram started in 2002, but if we look at the past few decades in Nigeria, before that in the north of Nigeria, there were a number of other Boko Haram type organizations. Each one was crushed and a new one started, sometimes within months thereafter or a year or so thereafter. And Boko Haram followed on another one that preceded it. Started in 2002 in the context of what many people in the north would regard as legitimate grievances, marginalization, unemployment rates in the north are higher than in the south. Illiteracy in the north is higher than in the south. All kinds of such problems which are worse in the north than they are in the south. This kind of came to a head when Goodluck Jonathan became president, before the term of the previous president had ended, because he died. I assume that means that his term ended. But Goodluck became president in his stead, and then got another 8 years or wanted another 8 years as president, despite the fact that there was this kind of agreement between the north and south that You'd have a Christian president and a Muslim president, Christian from the south, Muslim from the north. So this kind of just worsened the situation. But the situation was bad enough as it is. The general perception, true or not, is another debate, of marginalization of those in the north. The call for Islamic law, for Sharia in the north, is not a uniquely Boko Haram thing. That call has been there for a long time. In fact, aspects of Sharia have existed in the north of Nigeria for a long time, after independence. Of course, a long time before independence. You had the Sokoto Caliphate, etc., which the British co-opted. They co-opted Sharia to make it look like what they wanted it to look, which kind of robbed it, for some people, of some of its powerful aspects, and it became kind of family law, which the British did very effectively in India, for example. So even the notion of, and Boko Haram doesn't mean Western education is, how is it translated? Western education is sinful. Haram means prohibited. Boko actually means fake in Hausa, but it often is used to refer to, in northern Nigeria, to refer to Western style education. Because there's a general saying in northern Nigeria, let me try and remember, Ilimun Boko, fake education, right? As opposed to this kind of education that they had there, and of course all of these things are mythologized, the kind of education that they had there for centuries, which was authentic and indigenous and all of that. This Western stuff is fake education. So Boko Haram just tacked itself onto that. It didn't, of course, call itself Boko Haram when it started. Just tacked itself onto that kind of idea. So the grievances or the criticisms, the critiques, had already existed. Started in 2002, was then used also by politicians, both in the north and in other ways in those from the south. In the north, because they could be a bogeyman, because they had followers that could be used at election time, etc. They could also be the bogeyman that's used against the south to say, look, as long as our people remain marginalized in this way, this is what you're going to get. So they were useful in all kinds of ways. In 2009, as a result of a confluence of factors, they became violent. Okay? And I'm not saying illegitimate factors or legitimate factors, whatever. 7 years after they started, in 2009, they took up violence, particularly after Muhammad Yusuf, the previous leader, was killed, and the new guy, at that stage, it was the cusp of the change over from non-violent to violent, strengthened the violent aspect. And you now have what you have. They prefer these days to refer to themselves by another name, Wilayat Gharb Ifriqiya, the West African province of the Islamic State. But that's what it is. The point here is that Boko Haram would not have existed if those grievances, many legitimate, some not so legitimate, in the north of Nigeria didn't exist. And this is the story all over. When ISIS took over northern Iraq, just over a year and a half ago, spectacular. They just swept into Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, took over, robbed the bank. Well, I suppose they wouldn't say robbed because they were controlling by then. And the Iraqi army, which was multiple times the size of the ISIS army, turned and fled for all kinds of reasons. Yes, ISIS fighters are very, very strong, and in Syria probably the most feared fighters. But that wasn't the only reason. The corruption in the Iraqi army, all kinds of things. But the most spectacular thing about it wasn't that the Iraqi army fled as it did, but that the people in Mosul literally opened their town or their city for these fighters to come in. Tribal fighters in Mosul lined the streets to welcome ISIS into the city. And this was replicated in other parts of the north of Iraq as well. And so one might ask, what possesses ordinary people to welcome nutcases to take over and run their lives? Well, because they felt these nutcases were better than the other nutcases they were dealing with. Because the marginalization that they faced since just before the American occupation of Iraq ended, and certainly after the new government came into being, and particularly under Nouri al-Maliki, and not any improvement under Abadi, that people in the north, in the Sunni part of Iraq, have felt marginalized. Now again, you can have an argument about whether that perception is legitimate or not. That's not my point. The point is that they felt marginalized. They were not looked at as seriously as Shias were. Kurds were looked upon more seriously. Let me say, Kurds are mostly Sunni in Iraq. The Arabs are split between Sunni and Shia. So from the Sunni Arab perspective, the Kurdish Sunni were looked at more favorably because they had power. They wangled a deal, the Americans helped to wangle that deal for them, where they get sliced off an autonomous part of Iraq, and they had some control over that, etc. The Arab Sunnis felt that they were at the bottom of the pile. They were not getting their share of power, but they were also not getting their share of resources, etc. Through numerous attempts tried to redress that situation. It wasn't being redressed, it was getting worse. And when this Sunni brigade said, we'll rescue you, just let us in, they welcomed him. So again, you have a situation where ISIS didn't just appear from nowhere. Of course, ISIS's origin is Iraq. After the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 was when they really kind of took off. They kind of existed in Jordan, a group in Jordan which then relocated to Iraq. But that's what gave them the boost. But they remained one of many groups for a long time. But 2014 in Iraq was when they really came into their own, when they became a power to be reckoned with in Iraq. And to a large extent, because people allowed them in. Now many of those tribal leaders are today saying, well, after we get recognition of our rights from the central government, we'll get rid of these guys. That might be easier said than done. But why did you let them in the first place is because of these grievances that existed. And many of these grievances in general are compounded by foreign intervention in all kinds of ways. In Iraq, you can talk about the Americans. In Nigeria, more recently, the Chibok girls, by the way, when they were kidnapped, you know that the Chibok girls kidnapping wasn't the first kidnapping that Boko Haram had done in Nigeria. They had kidnapped ministers' family members, for example. They were always released. Not just released, they were ransomed. Okay, there was a deal made between the government and the group. The group got money, these people got their people back, and they kind of mediated in that kind of way. The Chibok girls thing became a global issue. You had foreign forces that came in to assist. There was no chance that there was going to be a ransoming that would happen. I'm just saying, I'm not blaming the Americans or the French or whatever for the kidnapping. I'm just saying that these grievances take on an additional life when there's foreign intervention that's involved. If we look at Shabab, and I really need to move on, I think move faster. When we look at Shabab in Somalia, Shabab came out of the destruction of the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia. So 1991, 92, 1991, when the Siad Barre government fell, there was no government in Somalia, really isn't any government in Somalia till now. No government in Somalia, and you found these local courts appearing that attempted to provide some form of judicial mediation in various parts, so in various towns, etc. That judicial mediation task became more. They started assisting with things like healthcare, education, those kind of things. By 2006, by 1996, some of these courts started merging. By 2000, they formed the Islamic Courts Union. And the Islamic Courts Union was kind of pseudo-government. So not only were they running courts, but they were doing all kinds of other things that a government that might have been in place might have been doing. They were also the best possibility that Somalia had since 1991 of having a decent government that would be acceptable to everyone. But that wasn't suitable for everyone concerned. The Ethiopians, encouraged by the Americans, came in and crushed the Islamic Courts Union. And as a result, you have Al-Shabaab. And we know what the result of that is today, having emerged out of the embers of the Islamic Courts Union. Many from the Islamic Courts Union, of course, some of the younger people went into Shabaab. Many of the older ones went into exile and then became part of these transitional governments at different times. If they were allowed to organically continue after 2000, things might have been very different in Somalia today. Another lesson out of that Somali experience, I think, is the need for all of us not to display knee-jerk responses to when we hear notions about Islam, Sharia, Islamic courts, Islamic radicalism. What the substance of those things are is actually much more important than what they might symbolically seem to imply. And so Islamic Courts Union, big red flag, go in, crush them, and destroy Somalia forever is what you get. Charles Tripp made a comment in a seminar at SOAS that, and this was after 2011, that the calls for Sharia in Egypt, he said, should not be seen as being extremist, but rather as a response to globalization and dictatorship. So people respond in different kinds of ways. I mean, I sometimes get asked by Muslim audiences, so what do you think of an Islamic state, not ISIS, an Islamic state? And my response generally for the past 20 years has been, if I knew what it meant, I would be able to answer it. So tell me what you mean, what is the substance, and I'll tell you what I think of it. Don't give me cliches, because I don't know how to respond to a question like, what do you think of an Islamic state? What do you think of radical black South Africans? What does that mean? Tell me what it means. Is it people who burn down universities? Is it people who protest against fees? Is it people who disrupt parliament? You know, what are you talking about? And then I can tell you what I think of it. Let's talk about Egypt, I think, because Egypt is very important. After the uprising in 2011, you had, of course, battles for influence in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood tries to make deals with the military in that period, for which it is still criticized heavily by all kinds of forces in various parts of the world. And then you get a Muslim Brotherhood president or Muslim Brotherhood candidate who wins the presidential election by slight margin, just like 1%. But he wins nevertheless. Okay? In any normal democracy, that would be taken as a win. He rules for a year when he's actually not allowed to rule. In fact, my argument has always been that the military has been in control in Egypt for the past 7-8 decades. Even that 1 year when Morsi was president, the military was in control in Egypt. He was not allowed to rule. There were fake shortages that were created, law enforcement officers who just didn't go to work. I mean, there's this famous statement of a police officer who in an interview said, when Morsi came into power, we took a 4-year holiday, basically until he's out of power. And so you had a situation at the end of the year, at end of 1 year, which was untenable. An uprising was then created, or protest was created, with the support of money by those who supported the military, as well as outside forces, particularly the United Arab Emirates, which supported the military, and you had a coup. The democratically elected government president was removed from power, what little power he actually had. The implications in Egypt we are seeing today. Egypt is an extremely unstable country, much more unstable than it was under Mubarak. The Sinai, where there's been insurrection, if you like, for years. In that period that Morsi was there was a bit of a lull in that, because they thought there's a possibility that their marginalization and the lack of resources, etc., might be addressed by this Islamist president. That place is now wilaya of ISIS. Okay, Egypt will never be the same. It is a huge mess. More importantly, for us, I think, is that the Egyptian experience of 2013, the coup and what followed the coup, was an argument that was used and continues to be used by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The argument is this. After 2011, and many of us read and wrote articles about this, about how the 2011 experience in North Africa and the Middle East has heralded the end of this form of Islam or Islamic protest that was represented by Al-Qaeda. That what we are seeing is that when people are allowed to take occupied democratic spaces, that is what they will opt for, rather than the Al-Qaeda kind of thing. And so by 2012, the Al-Qaeda discourse was really rock bottom. Al-Qaeda operationally was very quiet, and many thought that it was on its way out. Okay. Yes, there were some things that were still going on in Iraq, but that was a separate matter. That wasn't part of these countries that were undergoing these uprisings. What July 2013 did was it renewed life for Al-Qaeda and that kind of discourse. And ISIS came a year later. And their argument is simply this. This nonsense about democracy doesn't work. It's not for Muslims. It has never favored Muslims. And you've just proved it to us now in Egypt. When we told you about Algeria, we told you about 2006 Palestine, we told you about this, that, and the other. You didn't listen. Now it's proven to you. Ours is the only way, the way of the gun, and we impose Islam by force. You've just proven it for us. That was the argument. And so more than what Egypt meant for Egypt has been what Egypt has meant for us in the rest of the world. And we're seeing that now playing itself out. Let me go to the point about, because Anthony, I've taken much too long, to the second part of my topic, which is about ISIS being useful. And I'm going to be very brief about this because I'm going to make another point thereafter. Islamic extremism, rather, being useful. Its usefulness is there for a whole range of actors, and increasingly so. From the United States to Bashar al-Assad in Syria, to Salman in Saudi Arabia, to Netanyahu in Israel. Groups like ISIS are extremely useful. Bashar al-Assad in Syria has been saying from day one, from when the protests erupted, before there was the first bullet fired by the opposition, because of course the first bullets were fired by his soldiers, before the first bullet was fired by the opposition, that what we are dealing with is terrorists. No, this is not opposition, these are terrorists. Even though people who were on the street at that time were calling on our beloved leader, on Bashar, to change things. He said these were terrorists. After ISIS started sweeping across Syria his argument became legitimate, that we are dealing with terrorists. Of course, ISIS, most of its victims in Syria are not Syrian army soldiers. Most of its victims are members of the opposition and civilians. Victims in terms of life and limb, but also victims in terms of just the way that they live, are not those who support Bashar al-Assad. But that's a good example of how useful this kind of extremism has been. In Saudi Arabia, which is really ideologically is ISIS. ISIS competes on the rhetorical stage. ISIS competes with Saudi Arabia to say that we are more Wahhabi than you are, actually. That you are a deviant. That you have gone away from what you should be. We are doing it. And that's why the attacks that are taking place in Saudi Arabia are within this context. That we are the ones who are killing Shias in Saudi Arabia, not you. You're allowing these deviants to exist. We are doing the job that should be done. Okay? Saudi Arabia now uses ISIS as a reason for which they as a reason for clamping down on all kinds of dissidents in Saudi Arabia. Turkey. I'm not going to speak about the United States. That's really. I'm talking about these countries in the Muslim world rather. Turkey. They had two elections recently. The one election resulted in the AKP getting too small a percentage of the votes, 42%, and so there wasn't any. Basically, the parliament would be hung. So they had a second election later, where they got something like 49% of the vote. But the discourse in that period was this whole, and after that, now, the discourse now, this whole anti-ISIS discourse is being used in order to attack Kurds. How many victims of Turkey's war in the past few months has been actually people from ISIS? Israel uses ISIS as a way to demonize Hamas, even while they are treating Jabhat al-Nusra soldiers in their hospitals. So this Islamic extremism has become extremely useful for many of those in power, for all kinds of reasons, to justify their own position, to justify their war against dissidents, etc. And responses around the world, not only in these parts of the world, responses to these groups often aid them and aid in the recruitment. In Tunisia, after the attack in Sousse, there was a ban on reporting military deaths. There was a surveillance on mosques that was put into place, etc. In the US, after 2001, you had the Patriot Act. In Paris, in France, in the land of equalité, liberté, and fraternité, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but a socialist president put into place a state of emergency, supported by the vast majority of the parliament. Okay? Ordinary citizens' civil rights are under attack, and so these groups have become very useful in how they allow governments to undermine the rights that people have. Anthony, can I take 1 minute to talk about South Africa?
We're into Q&A time.
Okay,
So
okay, I'll stop. I'll talk about South Africa and Q&A if anyone asks.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Very good. So thank you very much, Na'eem. This was a nice tour, wasn't it? And a nice contextualization. Thank you very much. This is one input into a broader two-day conference. We've had different views. This is yet another view. I find it particularly powerful because it gives me a frame of reference to link several conflicts into several places. I won't summarize his entire talk. Give it to you afterwards. But now's your turn to ask a question or make a statement in the spirit of trying to deepen our knowledge as we have done yesterday. So I'll sweep across the room because the next facilitator is that you. It's probably going to hit me if I take too long. Sweep across the room, pick up a couple of questions and comments, leave it to you, Na'eem, and we have to move on really. Good. Just remember to introduce your name. There are newcomers here today.
Sure, thanks. I'm Andy Liebman. I'm from the U.S., from the RAND Corporation. And first, thanks, Na'eem, a really excellent presentation, thoughtful and thought-provoking. And as I run through your points, I can't actually identify a single thing I strongly disagree with. I mean, I think, the fact that governments use extremism to justify harsh activities, certainly harsh rhetoric. We've seen that in the U.S. fairly recently. The fact that foreign influence has had a negative influence on normal development in the Muslim world, that's undeniable. Military rule in Egypt, I think, is clear. Grievances is the basis of, a lot of the rise of extremism. I think for me, what was missing, perhaps, is some sort of introspection. Rather than trying to find an array of foreign influences that are to blame for the lack of democratic development in the Muslim world. There's also a problem within the Muslim world, within each of these individual countries. Morsi didn't only fail because the military made it impossible for him. Morsi was a really bad leader. I think it wasn't just that he wasn't allowed to lead. I don't think he was capable of leading. And there's a lot of different examples where there are internal reasons for failure, not just the foreign element, which is not just an excuse, it's certainly a factor, but too often used as sort of the only excuse.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm Mohammed Harun from University of Botswana. Maybe just to latch on what Andy had just mentioned. And that is, I think sometimes the flip side of that, Andy, is the fact that some would say that Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood were not given the necessary opportunity to basically, yes, I would agree, he might not have been a strong or leader as such, but that might be still very much a debatable thing. He never saw his term out as a democratic elected individual. So there's a different view to that. But just to come more specifically to your presentation, and that is when you started out, highlighted the fact, of course, sort of indicating being a radical, and of course you also highlight the fact that you make it, so highlight the specific difference between radicalism and extremism as such. And of course, when you made reference to Hassan Hanafi, and of course him saying, well, we turn a blind eye, my question would be, where do you then draw the line? Up to what point? Do we just keep a blind eye all the time? Or do we also at least monitor? Because we cannot also at the same time say, okay, they are here, they are basically part of us. And at the same time, they can be a danger at some point in the future. So, so it's a matter of having to sort of be concerned about that. Thank you.
How many hands are there? Let's just see. We're really out of time now, so it's 1, 2. Is your hand up? Yeah. Pardon? Really? 1, 2, 3. Is your hand up? No. So, plea for conciseness.
Okay. I'm General Soleko from the National Defense College. On the backdrop of this turmoil in the Middle East, how will Israel's foreign policy play itself out? Should Assad not fall? Should he fall, how will it impact on Russia's foreign policy, including the Obama administration support to the moderates? Thank you.
That's all for the next conference, by the way.
Thank you. I'm Sipho Manana from the National School of Government here in South Africa. Just a comment on the our president's pledge of technical assistance in Nigeria. What could be the implications for our government?
Sure. Na'eem? Warren, you must be the last one.
Thank you. Na'eem, very quickly, as I understand, you basically say there is clearly a time where it's fine to take up arms. Would there be a time for Muslims in South Africa to take up arms? And what would be the indications that we could see if that were about to happen?
So, Na'eem, you don't have to answer all these questions.
Yes. Thanks for saving me. Okay. Let me start with Andy's question. Andy, I'm sorry if it came across in that way. I make no apology for the messes that Muslims make in the Muslim world. I think that even if Morsi were allowed to end his term in 4 years, he would have been a bad president. But we don't get rid of bad presidents in that way. Otherwise, we would have had a coup in South Africa. By the way, just to clarify, Hassan Hanafi didn't say we must turn a blind eye. He was just saying that you can't talk of Al-Qaeda as being the enemy. They're on your side, even if you don't agree with, etc. I'm saying, however, that in communities, turning a blind eye is the option that people often take. because what they're fighting for seems to be what we think we should be fighting for. How will, the shortest question that I think is the subject of a whole conference, how Israeli foreign policy will play out, etc. And so, if you don't mind, I'm going to skip it. All right? Not because I don't want to answer it, but because I think I'm not going to be able to do it in a couple of minutes. Sipo, South Africa's pledge for technical assistance in Nigeria. I think it's problematic. I say that as an African who believes in the notion of African solutions for African problems and all of that kind of stuff. But I think that if we put special forces in the ground in Nigeria fighting against Boko Haram, we're opening ourselves up in a way that Kenya opened itself up to Al-Shabaab, and we refuse to do in the Somali situation. I'm not sure how carefully thought through this was, but I think it requires much more thinking before anything more is done. You don't really want to see South African soldiers falling in Nigeria, and the possibility that some of the people who are dropping South African soldiers there might end up in Hillbrow is not a good idea. Aren't Muslims in South Africa taking up arms? I don't see that in a democratic society like South Africa, where Muslims have all the rights that all citizens have, where all citizens have the rights that we do, as much as we might complain about some people in government, etc., where we have those rights and we have channels by which we can express our grievances, including protesting outside universities and all of that kind of thing, then getting locked up and having your father come to bail you out, including all of those things. Those exist in our law. With those kinds of channels existing for dissent, for protest, etc., I don't see any reason why anyone could legitimately, from my perspective, argue that Muslims should be taking or can be taking up arms against the South African state. There's another part to the question which you didn't ask, which is that what about South Africans that might think that they want to take up arms against someone else, not the South African state? And this is a real possibility. So the people that went to join ISIS, some of them just went to migrate, but some of them went to fight. Because I'm pretty sure, and I know some of them, would argue that it's not legitimate to take up arms against the South African state. But it's fine for them to take up arms against the Syrian state because of all kinds of reasons. And that's an area I think that we need to think about more carefully.
Good. So thank you very much to Na'eem Jeenah for his thought-provoking presentation.